So we welcome Dr. Laird today.
Thanks,
to
Vanessa. I'm very happy to be here.
So Dr. Laird, your title of your book is Take Your Oxygen First. So why is this important to care partners, and what exactly does that mean?
So I really set out to write the book after years of working with family caregivers and really watching them be at one time so full of compassion for the people that they love and are helping in the caregiving journey through a chronic illness like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. And I watched them be so full of love for their loved one that sometimes they actually forgot about themselves as a recipient of self-love. And the reality is, with my medical training, the reality is that the experience of being a caregiver to a loved one with a chronic illness is that there's a lot of potential for chronic stress. Even if things are going well and you don't necessarily feel it, the demands of caregiving can really encompass stresses on our bodies physically, our minds mentally, and our spirits sort of emotionally. And that reality got me really interested in finding a resource for my caregivers so that I could send them something and say, please read this and learn about also taking care of yourself. Well, we didn't really find that resource. And so this goes back about 10 years now. What we decided to do was we held a conference, and over about 10 weeks, we talked about ways that caregivers can help themselves while they're helping their loved ones. And through the course of providing that seminar series for our caregivers, we became aware of our mantra that we started teaching people, which was to take your own oxygen first. Before you can help others, you've got to make sure that you're set and nourished. And so that whole caregiver conference 10 years ago grew into the book that you're referencing. And that concept of, we've all been on the airplane before, and the flight attendant says, in the event of some crisis, those of you who are capable, we want you to put your own oxygen mask on first, so that then you're more fortified and able to help those around you. Same concept now applied to our caregivers. We really want our caregivers to understand that all that inclination to be loving and caring for their loved ones, we need to be sure that we're turning some of that on ourselves. There's very good reason to do that, so that you then become able to be fortified and really provide that role to your loved one.
Right. So you have a whole section of your book that focuses on the caregiver's mind: depression, anxiety, stress, and even anger. So we understand that that's an expression or an experience that the caregiver has, or care partner. But what are you seeing now in the context of our new challenges that we're facing with the COVID crisis?
Yeah, so more of everything. So everything you mentioned: depression, anxiety, just generic stress, anger, just really the uncertainty ahead. I think everyone sort of understands that the unknown is scarier than the known. And unfortunately, right now, there is much that's unknown. Now, interestingly, I have found amongst my caregivers, especially caregivers who are helping their loved ones through a chronic illness like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease, that some of my caregivers are more comfortable living with the unknown, because in many ways, chronic illness creates a lot of unknowns as far as our futures. And so I think understanding that there are going to be questions you can't answer, and yet still wanting to not let that take over, I think is what the message of the book really is. And what we tried to do in the book was sort of move towards any challenge and say, okay, let's say you have some feelings of depression, or you're angry, or you're feeling guilty. Any challenge that comes, let's educate ourselves about that challenge, learn about depression or resentment. And then learning about it, that's where the unknown starts to decrease and your power over whatever is unknown starts to increase, because you have that sort of educational foundation. Then from educating yourself, the next step is empowered. So once you sort of have that knowledge, then feeling empowered and thinking through, well, what could I do if I wanted to or needed to change my situation? You've still got the uncertainty, but you've got knowledge, and hopefully then you are able to start thinking of some ways to change. That's the empowerment. And then the final sort of the reward is what in the book we call the energy. And so that's where the change comes and the positive outcome comes. So we sort of weave that throughout the whole book, and I think it's been a good sort of infrastructure for our caregivers over the years to think through any challenge that comes up. Educate yourself about it, feel empowered, and look into making different changes, and then feel the reward once you're able to make that change and move forward.
Wonderful. So obviously it's one thing to learn about, your emotions, learning about the disease that you're caring for, you're helping your loved one care for. Those are some things that we do certainly have some control over, the education, the knowledge that gives us control. So when we're in a situation where there's all of this going on outside of this that we have no control, and that increases stress and anxiety, fear. How can we help people, care partners especially, that might feel responsible for themselves and their loved ones, cope with that? How can we help them process that?
Yeah, I think that what I would recommend is it really needs to be a very thoughtful and active approach. So what we try to stress is actually, if you've got some added stress from current situations. So example, a patient and a family I was helping this morning. The daughter is stuck outside the walls of her parents' assisted living facility. Lots of anxiety there. Mom isn't necessarily good at taking some of her medications. The daughter can't go in and help fill that medicine bottle anymore. So lots of anxiety there. What we talked about was this concept of thoughtfully approaching it. And when I say thoughtfully approach your problems, I'm talking about scheduling time to think about it. So as an example, the daughter, after we did our visit, I asked her to schedule 30 minutes with a social worker in my office who's then going to talk with her about this specific problem. So addressing problems as specific sort of issues does tend to help. You might think, well, that might just inflate it. Not necessarily, because if you schedule time and you're thoughtful about things, the next thing you can do is you can make a plan and plan to do whatever you're going to do to fix things. And then the final thing is you do it. There's been research that shows that people who plan ahead are more likely to do something and less likely to procrastinate. The planning part actually is a good motivator to our brains to actually take the final step. And one of the challenges as a caregiver is always allowing the need of your loved one to take precedence over your need. So in a situation where a caregiver is feeling particularly stressed or depressed, one of the things we talk about is scheduling time that they would take for themselves to think about their situation. Some sort of plan then is put into place to help them, and then that sort of momentum carries them to actually do that. And then, as with anything that you want to try to improve, you have to have a sort of a feedback loop. So we bake into the plan the fact that someone in a couple weeks will be checking back to make sure. So you can do that in the form of having, a caregiver buddy, one of your siblings who's out of town, who knows the situation that's going on. You guys you think it through, you spend time thinking it through, make a plan, you make the change. Then in 2 weeks' time, your buddy out of town is tasked to call you back and make sure, are you doing, X, Y, Z? And I really think, especially in this time of these new stresses, extra stresses, that thoughtful approach and then supporting yourself with a structure around it is what's going to help people, get through these extra stressful times.
So what kind of things are you recommending to your care partners right now in terms of managing all of the tasks and things that they have to do when they don't have their normal outside supports?
Yeah, and that's very tricky because right now there's a lot of people who aren't having people come into the home. Is that the kind of outside supports you mean? So like maybe
Yeah,
someone,
or even be able to take loved ones if they had to, like adult day centers and things like that.
yeah. So I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the word schedule comes up a lot. And one of the reasons that is because time is so challenged for all of us, and especially if you're a caregiver trying to keep the house going along with helping your loved one. And then remember, we're saying you've got your own needs too. So a schedule really that allows you to really focus on what does need to get done today and what do I want to get done today. I really think in this really, really stressful time, it's important to have a good balance. So you don't want to go too far overboard to getting all the needs taken care of without having something that you enjoy in the mix. And oftentimes those moments of what you enjoy are the places you're really going to have some really important moments between people from a relationship standpoint. So you don't want to let kind of the tyranny of the urgent sort of do a number on your daily routine. But I would recommend a routine. It can very easily, everything can kind of go to the wayside and the days one after another can just start to pass in this kind of a situation. So a schedule, a routine is very important. In addition, with certain medical conditions, and Parkinson's disease, as I don't need to tell this crowd, is one of those where schedule and medications and routines of exercise and rest are all really important. And so the more you can do as a caregiver to help keep the routine going, the better. With respect to your question about adult day, we've been very fortunate in our area here that a lot of the adult day providers have helped by either sending people home with lists of different activities and events that their loved one has really enjoyed, or we have a few that have put things online so that people, it's not the full experience of adult day, but if there are some very well liked activities and exercises and things that your loved one really enjoys, you probably can't completely recreate it, but you can add that to your roster for the day of different things. And there are also some newer things available online that we've never had before, as far as museum tours and different zoos are opening up their camera for the babies being born of all different animal species. So things like that can add some fun and enjoyment to the day, I really think is important. I would also say, don't turn the television on, especially not to the news. That's one thing I'm telling people to keep out of their daily routine, because I've had calls specifically about my loved one is watching the news and then the mood goes in the tanks and all different kind of irritating moments become, how we interact with each other every night after the news. So.
Yeah, I think that's something that we all need to put into practice is really limiting our consumption of the news and the negativity, and trying to find things that are more positive and fun and injecting some laughter into our lives.
Yeah.
So,
I was just going to add on to that, Anissa. one of the little catchphrases we use is, especially when times are very, very stressful, we try to remind families to focus in, not out. It's usually the outside world or something sort of outside of our personal relationships that's really causing trouble. Now, sometimes it is our relationships, but even more, focus in. I mean, those are the relationships that are often the most healing and the most soothing and the most important. So that's another reason, turn off the television, turn on something that, do find something that is a known, enjoyable activity between you and your partner, and really sort of work on the internal sort of relationship. And that often will help kind of soothe some of the extra anxiety that, especially these days, is coming from the outside.
Right. So speaking of engagement in different activities, excuse me, how about family members that live away? How are you seeing people engage with them and allowing them to get involved with care, even though they can't maybe be present physically, either because they're too far or because of safety concerns? What are you seeing in the care partners you're working with?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I'm going to have you remind me, because I think I'll talk about like long distance caregivers first, but don't let me forget the local caregivers too, like if all the siblings are in the same city or something. But in general, one of the things I talk with families about is understanding that caregiving is kind of this word, or being a care partner, it's kind of this word without a clear definition. And in many ways, what we all mean by it is one person helping someone else. And exactly what kind of help is being given can range, quite a bit, from helping someone, get their dinner to helping someone choose their health insurance. And so that's kind of my first piece of advice is, as you're thinking about the range of people who are in your life and who are caregivers or care partners who can help your loved one, you want to think through the various strengths and sometimes weaknesses of these individuals. Because one of the things in the book that became pretty apparent is that the book is essentially the story of Lisa Gibbons' family as they were in the throes of the sadness of losing her grandmother. Her mother developed symptoms of what would eventually be diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease. So Lisa and her two siblings became the support for her father, who was the primary caregiver. Of these siblings, Lisa was a long-distance caregiver. Her sister moved from California to South Carolina to be the in-person caregiver. The brother was already there. It wasn't his forte to become the in-home present caregiver. But what he was really good at was the legal, the financial. He took it all off the plate of Lisa and her sister Cammie. They had to do none of that. He took it all. So play to the strength of your siblings or of anyone who's in this group who's going to be helping you. Play to their strengths. You will be amazed what everyone can come up with in the form of help. Right now, a perfect example is we have one family who's one of their siblings happens to be long distance, and he's also the computer geek of the family. So he found various different online options to connect the family. So they're using one, I think it was called Care Tree, and he showed it to us the other day, and it's a way that he found he's contributing. He's doing all the signing up of everyone, and it's essentially a platform where families can all talk and look at one set of information about their loved one. So that's an example where even long distance, that individual caregiver was able to help the family because that's one of his strengths. And I really think it's important not to feel badly about having a strength that isn't hands-on caregiving. And hopefully as each of us works with other people, and if we're one of those people, don't feel badly. We're all made differently, and those talents coming forward are valid ways of helping someone. And so that's one of the things I'd point out. With respect to local or just groups of siblings who all want to help, I think as much as you can working together so that there isn't overwhelming presence. I sometimes tell people families often want to be together, and that's great. And I've come from big families. Caregiving is often something that doesn't have to have huge groups. And so one of the strategies to especially support the closest caregiver who's got the largest number of hours that are being given to the care process is for other siblings to actually take some of those hours and turn them into respite for the primary caregiver. Now that might be a spouse, or it might be an adult child, or someone other relation. But if that makes sense, we sometimes want to put a big activity together, but in the day after day after day long-term sense of caregiving, what can really be most helpful is if other caregivers find ways to take off of the primary caregiver chunks of time that can then turn into their respite. And you still want to play to their strengths. Like we have one family where the son loves taking his parents for bocce ball. So that's what he does every whatever day of the week. I mean, not right now, of course, but every day of the week he goes and takes them. That's a respite for the primary caregiver. And then that's where that primary caregiver gets to start thinking through, what are the things I need to do to take care of myself? Did I cover both areas, Anissa?
Yes, you did, really well. And
Okay.
actually leads me to several questions. So
Okay.
I'm going to go with one in regards to family dynamics. So can you talk a little bit about how you manage the situation where you might have family that is not being supportive to the primary care provider, care partner, or there's some stress within the whole family between siblings, some doing all of it and others not supporting it, and how you have worked through that with some of the care partners and families that you've worked with.
I just wrote myself a couple notes because I want to answer that. So I want to answer that in two ways. Because first of all, when there's dissension among caregivers, there's two aspects that have to be managed. Number one, you still have to provide care and make decisions and move forward. So there's handling that issue. But the second issue, in line with take your oxygen first, is that you need to take care of that primary caregiver who's getting some stress. So there's really the two pieces. So I'll take the first one first. And in general, my sense after doing this all these years is that there simply are some situations where there are personalities that, even amongst loving families, lead to different opinions about how someone's care should proceed. And in general, we try to explain to families that there ultimately has to be one person who is made responsible to help with an individual. Now, that's especially true in the bulk of the people I help. There is a time in their life where they need someone to make decisions for them. Now, in other situations where someone does not need someone to make decisions for them, we still ask them to identify one person, because we know that there are going to need to be some decisions made, and you really can't move forward if there's a stalemate because of difference of opinions and or squabbles or dissension. The body and diseases don't wait for that to resolve. There have to be decisions made. So in general, I recommend that putting aside differences of opinion, if the family can at least clarify who's going to help either make decisions with and or for the loved one. That's really important. And then once that's decided, if, let's say, I'm the primary caregiver and it's been decided in the family group that I am the family caregiver, my social worker just told a patient this yesterday. I just read it in an email or message yesterday. She had to remind our primary caregiver, who has a number of siblings who are somewhat negative to her, when she sees an email come in, if she can already see from the tagline that it's got a negative sort of anything, or she's not in the right frame of mind, she does not open the message until she's ready to, and until there's some need to. If there's no need from a caregiving standpoint, no decisions that need to be made, and she's the primary caregiver, there's a boundary created once you have that understanding of what the structure in the family is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You have to set that boundary, and then the actions follow that you have to protect yourself. So that's how we sort of ask families to work when you still have to make decisions despite dissension. Now, the challenge of that caregiver feeling okay about all of that is much more difficult. And what the social worker recommended, as soon as she doesn't open the email that she believes is probably a negative, she worked with her on having a mantra to say, so that she immediately replaces the negative with a positive, so that her mind isn't brought down, it's lifted up. And her mantra may have been something like, I am doing the best I can, my mother knows we love her, or I am doing the best I can, my mother knows we love her. And then she moves on, so that she's got a way to keep herself from being brought down by that negativity that's coming in, even from a family member who she loves, but there are some differences when it comes to caregiving decisions.
Absolutely. And I feel like there's a lot of emotions like guilt, frustration associated with it. One of our listeners said, this is great advice, hard to set boundaries and stay positive via email and text bombarding all the time. And this is just great advice in life in general. So I want to talk a minute about what you were kind of describing. If you have like your primary care partner that's making decisions. So let's talk a little bit about decision management and what people can do. And this is kind of a way of taking your oxygen first and making some arrangements in advance so that you're not, I guess, taken off guard in a crisis. And we're experiencing one now, so to speak. But can we talk a little bit about maybe some advanced care planning, the kind of conversations that we should be having even early on, just to minimize stress?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So as a geriatrician, my whole life is avoiding risk for my patients in their future. So to my mind, picking up a cane when you start to wobble is a really good thing. Now, my telling that to 9.5 people out of 10, they look at me like, no way, honey, I'm not doing that. I'll do it when I really, really, really have to, and I'm just about to fall. If you hand me a cane, I'll use it. Okay, so the human psyche, human nature is not to prepare ahead. And I think if there's anything I'm hoping comes out of this to some extent, is a bit more willingness to plan ahead. A sad example in my world recently was one of our patients. She's in her 80s and her children are in their early 60s, and we normally in the past had recommended that everyone have a healthcare surrogate. And I'm one of the big people who always said, I just need one name. I just talked to you earlier about just give me one person. We can't have a lot of dissension. We need one person. Well, in this crisis, one thing doctors have learned is we actually need two people. We need a primary person, but we need a backup. Because unfortunately, what had happened was her primary had passed away unexpectedly. And she now needed some decisions made. And now is not the time to have big family discussions about who's the next correct person to be helping her. And so it just really hit home that we all need to be rethinking our advanced care planning with respect to two people. That's just a small example, but to your point, yes, we need to be thinking about care planning. If you don't already have a clear sort of plan of who would talk for you, if you wanted someone to make decisions for you, I'd start there. Now get two people. And then be sure you have your personal copies of these documents. We've also learned that healthcare systems are not well equipped to have the most latest copy of anything. And so you really, as a consumer, healthcare wise, your medical record is really, to be sure the most current information about you is available to someone. Right now, we all still need to be responsible for that, and that includes your living will, your healthcare surrogate information. So I think, that's kind of one of the first things about advanced care planning is just knowing what you would want. The world of healthcare is primarily managed, if you think about it, by young and middle-aged people. By the time doctors and everybody who works in a hospital get to be retirement age, and they might have more of an understanding of what middle-aged and retirement age people might think, they're not working anymore. So the people you're talking with in healthcare often don't have your same sensibilities about your life, your values, etc. So the only way to get that clearly known and addressed the way you want it to be is to have your own documents available. So I think that's a really good, and I don't know what you all talk about, but the 5 wishes is a really good document that helps people start thinking about that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I feel like right now is a really good time, if you haven't done that, to at least start the conversation, because we have lots of time and we're together. And so it's an opportunity for us to kind of broach that subject, talk about what we want. And what I like about the 5 wishes document is that it takes you into some deep questions on your, just in general, your wishes, not necessarily like who you want as your healthcare surrogate, or what you would or would not want, if you were in a situation where you could decide life support or not, but just how you want quality of life to look for you. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about I think a place a lot of us are at right now, and that's just kind of boredom and apathy. So apathy is so common in Parkinson's, and now we're all faced with a little bit of that boredom of, I'm so bored, but I don't feel like doing anything kind of mode, just because it's been, more than a month for many people sheltering in place. And I'm just curious as to, how do we move beyond that? How do we combat this vicious cycle, especially like you said earlier, exercise is so important. Routine is so important for us when we're in this kind of a situation, but how do we get over this like blah state that a lot of us are in right now?
Well, I hate to sound like your mother or just an old sort of tried and true, but mind over matter. And that's in part where that schedule comes from. And my telling you about the research shows if you schedule it, you're more likely to do it. And so some of that is where my recommendation about having a daily schedule or a daily agenda of what you want to get done, it will help largely. But the other thing is I definitely think when we've been talking to patients in these last weeks or so, we've been trying to encourage people to look for new and different, because one of the, if you think about even your childhood growing up, oh, mom, I'm bored, tossing out ideas of the new and different is sometimes the moment of opportunity when something new catches. And so trying something new and different, but here's my twist. Go back into the old and familiar. So many of us haven't, picked up our instrument from high school in a while. Many of us don't play the card games we used to play. Some of us I had a man on the phone this morning. He said he used to do watercolors and he stopped, but his daughter bought him a kit that they have available nowadays again. It's come back into fashion. So, someone else pulled out their Parcheesi. Who remembers that game? Parcheesi board. And so they hadn't played probably for 30 years. So they both had to, dust off the cobwebs, but got back into it. So in that, you're doing a couple things. The familiar is always very nourishing to us, especially if it's something you really enjoy. That's a nice thing. But you're also kind of kickstarting the brain a little bit, and that's a good brain exercise, and we all need that, brain stimulation to kind of keep our brain as healthy as possible. So I'm telling people that make sure you schedule into the day something new and different, but remember it can be something old and familiar that you're just pulling forward. And then the other thing I think is an unused activity is music. And so I know, Anissa, we've talked about the power of music, and in Parkinson's disease in particular, it's got some additional, benefits, but that's a thing. So I think it's wonderful to figure out activities that you can do that involve music. And then I guess the final thing is where there's apathy, understand that some of that comes with the way the brain is changing, and appreciate that it's not that version of apathy isn't as much a choice as it is a symptom. And it's important as a caregiver not to sort of react against it strongly as if it was a controllable or chosen state, because the brain is actually able to bring about apathy it's not the same way, but similar to how the shaking occurs. It's an abnormality of the nervous connections, or of the nerves connecting and creating that motion that leads to the tremor of Parkinson's disease. It's an abnormality of the nervous connections that regulate emotion that lead to apathy. And so it's part and parcel of the illness. And I think in my experience, it's one of the symptoms that occasionally people get kind of judged for. And I'm just suggesting to the patients, I don't want you to feel judged for that, because it can come. And to the care partners, I'm just suggesting be careful not to apply that judgment too strongly, because often it's a symptom and not something that someone's actively trying to do. And in that light, I would also allow some downtime and quiet time. The brain, as it's changing in any of these illnesses that change it, I've heard from many, many patients about how fatiguing it can be to use your brain when it's a brain that is changing. And no one who doesn't have one of those illnesses, I think, has that ability to know what that feels like. But I've had patients tell me how exhausting it can be to, you know, be in a conversation or to be working on a physical activity of making tea or something. And so to some extent, one of the things I definitely want people to work into their daily routine along the lines of things you need to do is some downtime and rest time and alone time, if that's what your loved one tends to prefer. It's okay to have some of that downtime too.
Absolutely. And I think right now, because we're all kind of in the house together 24/7 for the most part, we all need to feel that ability to separate and do our own thing. But it can be challenging for some care partners, especially if their loved ones require a lot more supervision or hands-on assistance. So how do we help these care partners find time for themselves in those situations? What kind of recommendations might we be able to offer?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I'm glad you brought it up, because one of the things I tell people is you can help yourself even when you're still in the room and helping your loved one. And what I usually say is, why not do what you're going to do to help yourself with your loved one? So a great example is relaxation breathing. So everyone can benefit even from 1 minute of relaxation breathing. And you can do that with your loved one. And I generally tell people, depending on if you, like my watch now tells me when it's time to take that breath. And at first when it came up, I thought, oh, for Pete's sake, are you kidding me? But you know what? I do it now. No matter what's happening, I look at that and I'm like, okay, fine. I do it. And it is a remarkable, there's been plenty of evidence that shows that just that minute is a way of decreasing the heart rate, decreasing the blood pressure. Those are those stress markers that I was talking about that have the potential to, over time, chronically damage us. And so that's an example. Why not, if you are really closely needed for your loved one on a 24/7 basis, do some of the work for yourself with your loved one, so you both can do that breathing. There's also, you know, so generally I tell people, if you only got 1 minute to yourself or with your loved one, do some breathing. If you've got 5 minutes, think about figuring out a mantra. And all that is a sentence or something that kind of gives you the thought you want to use to motivate yourself. I had one caregiver, and her mantra, and I've been telling people this for years, is I am doing the best I can. And that, you know, her saying that to herself was just a world opening for her, and a way of letting her sort of move through a very difficult situation. But you can come up with whatever you want. And as a partner, as a couple, you can come up with something that you say together that helps you have a better day, or respect and love your relationship, or, you know, help think about one of your loved ones who needs your prayers. You two can decide how to spend that time. You're getting the help as the caregiver, but you're there with your loved one, and you're both getting the help. And then, so 1 minute you breathe. If you've got 5 minutes, think about the mantra that you're going to stop, and you're going to do your relaxation breathing, but you're also going to be thinking through your mantra. And then I generally say, if you've got up to 10 minutes, one of the best things you can do is walk. And so now some of us have a loved one who could take a walk with us. Some of us don't, so you may have to modify that. But did you know Nelson Mandela, everyone remembers Nelson Mandela, he exercised in his cell, his jail cell, however that is. He used to run in place 3 miles every day of his incarceration. Ever since I've heard that, I've felt very guilty anytime I complain.
I think we all should feel guilty.
I can't exercise. So talk about guilt. Yeah, there you go. But just the concept of that, he's right. You know, I now have many patients. We're calling them back after we had our first visits, and we're calling them back, and they said, Dr. Laird, I got my root fixed. So we're having their loved ones time them for 10 minutes, and they make some loops around the house, and they find out how many loops around their home is 10 minutes of walking. And they do their loops, and that's, another exercise is an endorphin and producing activity. And endorphins are these wonderful happy pills, or happy chemicals, not a pill, happy chemicals. And so, again, if you were to do that yourself, you'd get a benefit. If you can't be away from your loved one, then be with your loved one and work some of that into your day.
So, in all that you just said, you've covered really good ways to exercise in the house, ways to emotionally connect with your loved one and kind of create that intimacy with them, finding some fun and distraction. So those are really helpful tips. I'm curious if, we've talked a little bit about the care partners and some of the anxieties that they might experience and obviously their loved ones, but what do you recommend if their loved ones are more anxious than usual, even if anxiety is something they already are experiencing? How can they calm them down? I know you mentioned the relaxation, breathing, and all of that. Are there other tips that you can give our care partners today for that?
Sure. So one of my favorites, and this goes back to the comment earlier about being prepared. One of my favorite tips is that we teach our caregivers that they need to be prepared to think fast. Now, FAST is one of those acronyms. It's going to stand for things, FAST. And basically, these are going to be things that you could be prepared to do if your loved one starts going down a path of negative thinking or becomes very anxious, or anything that you want to change the tone of the day or the tone of the moment. You're going to think fast. So you're going to think about things that are really well known to you that help make your loved one turn, and it's a positive thing. So F, food. Is there a food that your loved one really enjoys that you could, offer? Got to have it on hand, but food. Is there an activity that you could, recommend? Something that's kind of tried and true that you both are going to enjoy. You've got all the necessary supplies, something like that. Is there a story or a song? So that goes to music, but story. Don't forget story. There's many of our, many of us in our relationships have important moments that are happy places. It may be, who knows, a birth, a wedding, a trip, whatever. But those are those happy places. And we all usually know and can start talking about those sorts of things. But that's an example where you want to know what it is that would connect your loved one. And then the T is trip. So now that's one we have a little trouble with right now. But normally we tell people, hey, if you've got a favorite park, or one of my most favorite examples from a caregiver after he used our Think Fast was the remedy for them was a trip to Dunkin' Donuts. And so they ended up, if they really got into a pinch, they got in the car and went to Dunkin' Donuts. Can't do that right now, but I'll have to think on my feet for another T. But the idea is to again, think ahead. Think ahead. What are the things that could be a positive to sort of push out the world out there, and what's a positive in your world? Again, the FAST. Have that all ready so that when something happens, you're not trying to think what. You're like, no, I'm going to think fast. This. What'll work in this situation? Boom, I've got it. And you're then taking control and turning that event into a less stressful moment.
Well, and I think you mentioned earlier in the talk that they're doing so many online museum tours, and some of the zoos are taking their cameras in with the animals. So even though we might not be able to go on a trip, we can take a virtual trip. So yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to just see if there's a few of these questions that's come in that maybe we haven't answered through our discussion today. So one person mentioned when we were talking about some of the stress earlier for the care partners, compassion fatigue.
Mm. Yeah, compassion fatigue. That, and did they have a specific question, or they just wanted that
No,
topic?
they just said, I've heard to it as referred as compassion fatigue.
Yeah, that's so well put. And I really, as we opened, I mentioned that, caregivers, not everyone steps up to be a caregiver. Um, and, some of us have that instinct and others don't. And caregivers generally do have the compassion kind of instinct. But as I mentioned, it often is more outward than inward. And what can happen, and I think we're hearing about it now too, with respect to first responders and even healthcare providers, is if you aren't careful, all the pushing outward leaves your own psyche more fragile. And so that's really where Take Your Oxygen First came from, as kind of a thank you to caregivers, but a bit of a wake-up call, to be perfectly honest. I didn't want our caregivers to go down that path to the point where compassion fatigue, because there's actually some positive benefits of being a compassionate person. There's research that's been done since that book came out. There's been research done on compassion, and higher rates of compassion are actually a good antidote to the negative stress hormones, which is interesting. So no one's kind of put those two together, but we do know that that pay it forward kind of mentality, generally individuals have a generally better sort of mental health profile when people tend to have a compassionate outlook on life. And so my hope is that with caregivers, paying attention to the Take Your Oxygen First kind of message, that will get them into a better place so that they can reap the benefits of having been, this kind of compassionate, pay it forward type of person.
All right, I had to mute myself because my dogs were losing their mind in the background, as I feared they would. All right, and then there was a question here earlier. Let me see. Are caregivers more worried and stressed about the future progression of their patients than are the patients themselves?
That's an interesting question. It varies. I'd say it varies. So, and it's often two different things. So our patients tend to be worried more about what their changes will do to their loved one, because they don't want to be a burden to someone else, especially someone they love. Whereas our caregivers are genuinely worried about the decline of their loved one. So you see how those two have a little bit of a similar issue, but different perspective. And, to me, as I'm working with families, I think that's a healthy balance, because it respects the fact that one disease can affect two people, and it I think leaves them looking at those effects and trying to make sure they're paying attention to those. In the situation where many of my patients have more of the cognitive, so thinking changes, one of the aspects of our thinking that can change, especially as a disease progresses, is our insight and our ability to understand that we have declined, for example. So patients with Alzheimer's disease often will have less insight than someone with Parkinson's disease or heart failure or cancer. Any of the illnesses that don't impact our thinking as much, there's more potential that you will be aware of your physical decline. And so then we try to a little bit differently depending on what has, what their situation has led to.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I don't know if there's any more questions here, but I really appreciate all of this information that you've given us and just sharing some of your wisdom with us and your book. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to share with our audience before we end the day
No, I
that we
really,
didn't cover.
oh no, well, we covered a lot of good ground, and I really think the book, actually, I want to echo that what you mentioned about written for people with memory loss, but the the lessons of it are very universal. And there's one chapter that covers Alzheimer's disease, but other than that, if you were caring for someone with Parkinson's disease, or are someone with Parkinson's disease and want to know, how to protect your care partner, your caregiver, it's very, applicable. And the lessons are more human than they are related to a particular disease. So that would be my only point. And Lisa Gibbons, her foundation out in California, has continued to work for support programs and things. And that's where the proceeds for that book have always gone and still go today.
Wonderful. Well, and we have obviously been lucky enough to have a lot of support programs available now online with everything. So we have support groups here at PMD Alliance that happen 3 times a week virtually. We have one this afternoon. We have one on Thursday that's just for the care partners. So if anyone in the audience today has not joined the Care Partner in Adult Children Support Group, we have that this Thursday. And we have one on Fridays that's specially for those who are dealing with loved ones in a facility and are trying to navigate that. We also have some additional programs this week you all might be interested in, just to let you know that we have a talk this week on nutrition coming up, and you can find all of our programs on PMD Alliance's events at a glance. I want to just draw your attention to that. But Dr. Laird, I really want to thank you for giving us your time today, for all of your wonderful information. We put the information about her book on the chat feature, Take Your Oxygen First. So feel free to check that out on Amazon. And just thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome. I was happy to do it.
All right. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.